Hello, everybody, and welcome to Music Industry Insights Worldwide. And today we've got Patty with us. Hi, Patty. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Thank you.
Good. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself, where you're from, and what you do?
Sure. I am from Oak Park, Illinois. I think it's the birthplace of Ernest Hemingway, so creative place. But I am an author. I also do spoken word, and I'm a psychologist as well, but
So, so
author first.
you've got very, very many varied hats there. How does that kind of work together, and how do you figure that out in your mind, like when you're doing your work?
So I think I was kind of like, at a young age knew that I wanted to write. So whatever forms I could write in, I do that. And it meshes well with being a psychologist because so much of emotional processing, it takes a form of creativity
Yeah,
to explore how you're doing emotionally and what the world means to you, what like sense of self means. And so I do tap into my writing. And if somebody's a singer, a creative, I love to really bring that into the work that we do in their emotional journey.
that sounds
So,
interesting. And you're creative yourself, so you write books. So tell us a little bit more about that too.
so I do some poetry unpublished. It's kind of just right now I'm like protecting it. It's my baby. So I don't share my poetry, which I'm going to be doing though. So I have a chapbook that I'm putting together.
Yeah.
Um, and that is called A Needle for Torn Lovers.
Mhm.
So it's kind of what is the state and idea of love and how we can kind of, sew love together, rip it apart, all with the same needle. Um, and then I do a lot of writing on mental health as well as my experience of being an Indian woman in America. So I have a book of essays on that and just kind of like, essays on like people kind of like kind of being like, huh, like, so what are you? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
in kind of this inquisitive way, maybe, but also sometimes in this like way of like, oh, like, what are you? So I can like discriminate you against you with this like kind of, formulaic process.
Which
Um,
that's not okay though, is it, in this day and age? It shouldn't be
yeah.
happening. And as a
Yeah.
psychologist as well, like that obviously, do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about what that actually is? Because I'm not sure everyone would even know. So what does a psychologist actually do?
Sure. So, a psychologist is somebody who is a therapist.
Yeah.
So somebody who works with people on emotional healing as physicians work on physical healing. And in fact, a lot of what I do integrates the two. So, people oftentimes will come into their doctors often say like, oh, I'm having headaches, I'm having stomach aches. Doctor's like, okay, let's do some lab work. Let's try to figure out what the source of it is.
Mm.
Oftentimes it can be, or sometimes can be, especially if there's no medical cause, it can be related to something emotional. And so that's when I would come in and say, okay, like, why do you think you're having these physical symptoms? When does it happen? What just, is there anything in your life that has impacted you, been stressful for you recently? And then that like opens the door into processing and, the journey to healing from whatever the thing is that's manifesting physically. But, often too, it can manifest as depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. I say too, like, if we're alive and breathing, we've experienced trauma. And so, what is your trauma? And is it even something that, a person is aware of? A lot of times we don't want to think about the difficult things and it's like
Yeah.
deep within ourselves. So that's what I do, yes.
I think that's great, actually. And do you know what? It really relates to music as well and the creative arts because a lot of people that have suffered from trauma, especially from a young age, they go into creative arts and they
Mhm.
want to create stuff and they want to express or they want to let out some of those feelings. So, there's a lot of us in the industry, and I think it's a good way of kind of healing as well and a way of
Mhm.
dealing with some of that trauma you've been through. And I've obviously been through quite a lot myself when I was younger, being born
Mhm.
to two deaf parents and my mum going away. So I think I'm really well understood about my own kind of issues, and I go to therapy myself, which I find
Mhm.
really, really interesting and helpful actually, because it gives you those tools and techniques to be able to understand yourself better as well and how to
Mhm.
cope. with some of those symptoms that you might deal with, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes. And yeah, I think yeah, I was reading your bio somewhere on the internet.
Yeah.
Um and thought like, yes, this is just, just sharing our vulnerability is so powerful because we all do hold it in some form, and it is very courageous to share it, to seek therapy, because it's a difficult process, but we also cannot hold it because it has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And when it manifests in the body, that's when it just becomes dangerous over time. So, yeah, and I love that bridge between art and emotional healing.
And do you find a lot of your clients work in the arts as well?
Yes, coincidentally too, I think therapy is such a spiritual process, and I see people who just thematically, like they may not even call themselves creatives, musicians, or authors or whatever it might be, but they're writing, like often they're creating music, they're writing lyrics to songs, they're dancing. And so like really connecting with that, and what they're, the beautiful part is like they're like, oh, I haven't thought about this since I was a child, how much I really love this and how much I've moved away from doing this. But it means so much to me. And so like we do that work, and whether it's connecting that they are creatives, or they come in and they're like, oh, I'm a musician. I'm like, oh, that's beautiful. Like I do spoken word. My husband's a music producer. Was in a hip hop group for many years here in Chicago called Rubber Room.
Okay.
And um and so it's like, the synergy with that
Yeah.
is so cool. It's a different language. So it's always very exciting to work with people who are wanting to tap into that creativity. So
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that, Patty, as well. Like, how long have you actively been doing like your book writing and your creativity? Have you always done that alongside your psychology work?
I started writing poetry. I remember like this young authors contest in like first grade. And so like I often told people about that. I'm like, think way back into like, grade school. What did you connect with? What like, did you play the recorder? Did that like connect for you? Did you like do like, different instruments later? But like, yeah, so like I think about that all the time. I was in this contest, this young authors contest. And I was like, oh yeah, I really like this. But I really started like when I don't know, like in my teens, I started to kind of apply to contests for poetry writing and things like that. Um, and then I in my early 20s, I started an essay. It was like a 5-page essay about my relationship with my husband. So I'm Indian. I was supposed to be arranged, very strict conservative Christian parents. Um, who immigrated to America. And so I was supposed to be arranged, period. No dating, no like, so I had had this boyfriend secretly for 2 years.
Yeah.
Um, and got pregnant. Oops. And then so like so
Oh,
like and he's black. He's not Indian. He's not like, what my parents wanted for me.
yeah.
So like that in itself, just the
Stigma.
yeah, the stigma of it, the paradox of it, like what they wanted versus like what I did, and I was just, I was bad for doing that. Um, I started to write a lot about like what it means to be like a good little Indian girl. And I started to write a lot about my story with me and my husband. And I'm like, I think there are a lot of people who, for many reasons, two people can both be Irish, but be two different types of Christian, or, there's like so many ways that people separate. And so I was like, I really want to tell this story. And that story turned into a book. And now I'm working with the agent to find a publisher on this memoir that like I never thought I would be so vulnerable with, but it's been wonderful. The process has been wonderful.
Actually, and very relatable because I think there's a lot of people over here in the UK as well that are Indian born, British Indian, but the
Mm,
culture around it. And I think, you know, some of my best friends are actually Indian, and they've some of them have actually been kind of forced into arranged marriages, and some of them don't want to get married or be in that situation, which can cause
mhm,
big problems. And one of my ex-boyfriends, he was actually Indian as well, and obviously me being trans, that was a
mhm,
big issue as well. And I find the culture can be very much in your business more so than other
mhm.
cultures, right? How have
Yeah.
you felt
Yeah.
with obviously being in the United States as well? Like, how has that impacted you being an Indian in the United States and then obviously being with a partner and falling pregnant? Did your
Mhm.
friend talk to you? Did they disown you? Or do you still get on with them? And how did that work?
It took about 5 years and two children later for them to finally say, at least for one of my parents to say, hey, I'm really sorry. And we just didn't know, but like your husband is like, you guys are a match made in heaven, and like only God can like bring people together. And it was just like so transformational because I thought like when I told them that they would be like, yeah, well, get the hell out of our lives. Like, they definitely like they called me names. They were like, you're bringing shame on our family. And like it was just so taboo. Like I don't know that I knew anybody else who I knew a couple people who had relationships out of our like Indian community. Um, but no one that got pregnant.
Yeah.
So there were a couple things going on. And marrying a musician, and they're like, wait, you're pregnant by a Black musician? Like, what the hell's happening? So it's like discrimination of all types, racism, but my dad especially was like, oh, like, okay, I get it. I get it. Like I didn't get it. And everything was it was really ugly in the beginning,
Yeah.
honestly. But thankfully they love their grandkids, they didn't like put that like ignorance. It was all ignorance. They didn't put that on the kids. Uh,
Yeah.
but then there's also these like insidious ideas about race. And so I had to be very careful to say, oh, well, that's not cool to say because your grandchildren are biracial, your grandchildren are Black.
Yeah.
And, you know, and they're like, oh, we didn't even think about it that way. Or, oh, that's just how we talk. And so, like, it's just getting under.
Deconstructing that, isn't it?
Exactly.
That
So,
Wow, that's really massive, actually. And obviously, being in the United States and being Indian as well, did your family put a lot of pressure on you to do well, or to, for example, be a lawyer, be a doctor, be something, aiming very high as well? Was that pressure put on you from a young age?
it was definitely like exactly like you said, just that pressure to, like you have to be a doctor, you have to be a doctor. And I was like, but I don't want to be a medical doctor, so I chose to be a psychological doctor. But they're like, what's a psychologist? Like, why do you want to do that? And like, why do you want to be a writer? Like, you're going to be poor. And um, and I wanted to learn guitar and I wanted to, and they just were like, no, like it's a very prescribed society, unfortunately, especially for girls and women. And so there's that layer as well.
Yeah.
So,
And coming back to your book writing, your poetry, what kind of barriers and issues have you faced doing that as well?
um, well, I think like in a general sense, just the idea of poetry and how much poetry is or isn't valued.
Mm.
I think that for a long time had been in the back of my mind about like, oh, how does society portray poetry?
Yeah.
And then I had to let that go. I'd say like, who gives a shit? Like can I say bad words?
Of course you can.
I'm like, who gives a shit? Like these are, my feelings and this is how I write them out. Because there's that inner critic always, whether I'm doing like spoken word poetry or like, whatever. But it, from another sense, it's like floating in an ocean. It's like, man, like I just get to chill and write. And like, even if the sentences don't make sense,
Yeah.
um, You know, I think I have like given myself that freedom, even if like society as a whole is like, oh, it's poetry. Like we have our like, you know, there's small number of people who love and appreciate poetry. And that's everything. Like community in poetry is everything.
That's really, really important. Obviously, how's that impacted you and the way you feel about poetry and writing books? Like, has that kind of changed your mind at all, or has it made you more determined and empowered you more to succeed?
Um, for me, I really had to protect this idea in my mind that this was only for me at the end of the day. Um, like why do I write? Like I do write for others to read my writing. Like I love sharing it, like outside of the poetry. Like I share a little bit of poetry here and there, but when I'm writing essays, when I'm writing books, I want people to read and to be able to say like, oh yeah, I can connect with that. And like I don't feel so isolated anymore because this person is sharing her experience and I can see,
Yeah,
how they align. But there's always that critic, whether that critic in my voice is like the voice of my father saying like, oh, why would you tell people stuff
right.
that's so private? Like why would you expose us? And again, it's that theme of like you're bringing shame to the family. So even in my writing, I had a lot of guilt about writing our stories, our family stories. But then I'm like, no, like I'm writing for me. So I'm like, all right, Dad, I love you, but you need to get out of my head right
Oh,
now.
that's beautiful.
and and just like the Indian community, there's been such a fear placed in us. And you may have sensed this with your ex-partner's Indian community. But it's like this hovering monster of like a group of people in your mind. And like, you know, years ago, like me and a friend would be like, oh, let's go to the gas station and pick up some cigarettes. And we're like, what if this auntie sees us or that auntie sees? And it's like they're always in your freaking heads. And it's like, no, like whether they're not the people reading the stories.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's the people who are like, oh man, like I really don't want an arranged marriage, or like I'm Christian, but I want to marry someone who's Muslim. And the Indian community is like,
yeah.
no
Something
Barack.
you can relate to, right? And say, actually, I know what that feels like because I know what I've been through that myself. And that's
Mm,
the people that will draw you to that book, right?
yeah.
Definitely. And how do you find the equality, diversity, inclusion is over in the United States for authors and book writers and poets, especially for
Oh.
Asian culture?
I think it's the same old story, or like the new old story, I guess, of like this implication, or uh, just the talk of increasing diversity and inclusion. But then is it really happening? Like I just saw that it was like the 100 best books on the New York Times list, I think, and like very few were truly diverse.
Right.
Um, and so that can be discouraging. I'm like in the process of looking for a publisher. My agent is beautiful. She's a beautiful person. And we have conversations about like what is needed. And she's like, your story is needed. She's like, it's sweet. She's an Italian woman. And like she like vibes with like some of the like, the cultural aspects. Um, and she's like a soldier for like, yeah, let's get more diversity
Mm,
and inclusion into the world of writing. But then you have the powers that be who are like, oh, but we've had like a couple of Indian authors in the past 5 years. So that idea and pushing against that, I think like I just hope that like more diverse voices of all types just continue to remain in the arts.
yeah,
And to push these like ceilings of like, oh well, we've already had like blah
yeah.
blah blah. But it's like everybody's story is so unique that it's like we can't have enough of anybody. It's like let's have everybody tell their stories.
I find that in the music industry as well, actually. Sometimes I think, there's one in and one out kind of thing. Like they've got a couple of these artists that are the same, and that's as far as it goes. Like we don't really see that richness of diversity and inclusion that I would like to see. We are making that progress, but it's still not there yet. So that's
Mhm.
probably the same way you're facing it as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And
Absolutely, yeah.
and what's your kind of advice to other people like yourself that are looking to do that and break those glass ceilings? What kind of advice can you share with them on succeeding and keeping their passion?
Mm. Yeah, I think like, staying focused on the why, like why are you doing this, is so important because like if we're trying to do it solely because we're like, yeah, like I just want the, I don't know, like the fame or nothing wrong with like wanting people to know about your work, but like what is the reason?
Yeah,
Is it for your healing? Is it for the healing of other people? And like that's where like the psychological aspect is so closely tied. I would say like to keep that as your anchor because like even so I do some work with my husband. He does music production and he's done him and another Chicago producer, and like even watching them over the course of time, like his experience with hip hop in Chicago, even like the support and lack of support, and Chicagoans themselves saying like, oh well, we already have like different hip hop artists, so it's like, but we can have more, and we
right.
can, there's like no limit to that, but it's like the on both ends, the support that they've gotten as a hip hop group, the lack of support, um, it's like sensed just in different levels of community, whether it's the industry, whether it's like Chicago itself, smaller communities in Chicago, and like the support or lack of support, and that makes all the difference for an artist,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
Um,
It's also
so
the cultural aspect as well, isn't it? Because you're actually representing a culture as well as yourself, but also
right.
bring that within that culture and trying to lift it up as well. So that could be a lot of responsibility in itself, can't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like there's, in terms of longevity, thinking about like music and writing, but like even in terms of music in Chicago, longevity has been something where I'm like, oh, like there's this amazing group called Funkadesi.
Yeah.
Um, and they have artists who are from different parts of the world, who have such eclectic instruments that they put together and have been doing this for many, many years. Really cool group. One of the guys from there is a psychologist as well.
Ooh,
But I kind of I admire them so much for being able to do that, especially as they're a lot of what they do is about promoting like, oh, look at us. Like we're so different when you look at us, but we come together with all of our differences, and like speaking about the cultural aspects of it is just super cool.
yeah, I
So
love that actually. And do you think cultural and age differences have an impact on the amount of inclusion and diversity we can achieve at the moment? And do you obviously think the older people are, the less understanding and supportive they are?
you know I that's a great question. um I think there's so much talk about like, oh, boomers and millennials and like I think there's like so much separation that doesn't have to exist, and like when I compare culturally, how different age groups are seen in American cultures. I was born in Chicago, but like, my parents immigrated when like my mom was pregnant with me when she immigrated. And so like so much of what I've done over the course of my life is compare the two cultures and what I know of both. And the way that people of different ages are honored in Indian culture. So this is like, a positive aspect of our culture where like older people are honored, and it's like, oh, you're giving me wisdom about like my life. Younger people are seen as like, sometimes are seen as like, oh, they're younger and they have this new and young energy and let's like pour into them. Whereas in American society, we are really divided and youth is worshipped and all of those things. But I believe that like if like me as like now going into like being the older part of the group, to be open about differences in younger generations and kind of nurture that and say like, hey, like your music style is so different than what I know, or like your writing style is so different. But like, I wonder how cool it would be if we collaborated, or like teach me about what you know. And just the, the appreciation for different generations art
I,
would.
I think that's really, really important, actually. And thank you for sharing that with us. Like, and obviously you're a psychologist and you're an author and your husband works in music. Do you find you can obviously see the impacts that being in a fast-paced environment can kind of have impacts on your mental health and your well-being? How do you kind of navigate that and support obviously yourself and your husband?
Mm, yeah, absolutely. So I think both from, being a psychologist, from being an artist, yeah, both are like, okay, let's go, especially since COVID, in terms of like the psychological aspect of things and how much like things really haven't gone away in the ways that we would like to believe and pretend. So there are a lot of remnants of like social anxiety and increase in things like OCD and the trauma from it all. So it's become even more fast paced. But I think, you know, I see this a lot on social media, like, oh, like, art is my therapy.
Mhm.
And I do agree with that largely. I mean, I think people should still go to therapy for sure, it's good to have that soundboard. But I think I'm kind of like, wow, thank God I have art, because like doing the work is so beautiful, and like to be in those like intimate conversations with people, and like the journey and the growth, and like it's just so it's so beautiful. It's also very heavy.
Yeah.
And so then I go to like my artist side, and I'm like, okay, like let's write a song, let's write a piece of poetry, but then I think too, because I'm shifting to like working on getting something published right now, there's also that like, oh, is this marketable? And like, and who's gonna want to even read this? Like all of the little like questions come up, and the insecurities of like, oh, is this even good enough? And like, who even cares? And so I have to protect my writing and my creative side by kind of, going back to what I said before, like those like inner critics in my mind, like, nope, like I can't do that right now, because this is my safe space here. I can't like allow it to be convoluted by, the scariness or whatever. So,
It's really
um,
interesting, actually, and good luck with the book. And I hope you do get a publisher. And there's obviously publishers that do listen to this as well. So fingers crossed, and people will be able to contact you in the description below, because I'll leave all your details there as well. I
okay.
was just going to say as well, like, obviously, when do you ever get time for yourself? And how do you deal with self-care and your own mental health? Because you take on a lot of other people's issues and baggage. And
Mhm.
obviously doing all these other bits. How do you do that? That's an awful lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've definitely had to pause to do a lot of reflecting, like, your question about or the example I was talking about with like physical symptoms. That's been me. Like I've had times when I've had like really bad migraines, and I'm like, oh, like I wonder why I'm having migraines. And like it's amazing how we can compartmentalize and like not recognize like why we're having different, whether it's emotional or physical processes happening within us. Um, and then I stop and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I've kind of been doing a lot lately. And so like pausing and like mindfulness has been everything for me, form of whether it's in the form of like prayer or walking or breath work, or just like staring at my little puppy who's always next to me. um he's so cute. Whatever form that comes in, to stop and pause and say like I need a moment. Definitely things like exerting energy, like I just have a lot of energy to exert, and so like I love tennis. you
That's good.
know I go to my writing, but I love traveling as well, and just like connecting with all the things that help like soothe me and restore me. I do.
That's
So
great, actually, because I do, like, in the mornings, I do some meditation, some
mhm,
affirmations, and I
mhm.
tell myself that throughout the day as well, like, because I think that really helps that positive thinking and gratitude. It's a real another one that really helps me in being in the nature, being
Yeah.
outside, with nature and animals. It just grounds you and it makes you feel like, you know what, this is amazing. So I do that a lot, or go for a walk, or do some sports because it really does help to clear the mind.
Yeah.
We're
That's
running out
wonderful.
of time. We don't have much time left. So I'm going to ask you, is there any major wins or successes that you would like to share with us? And how can the listeners connect with you if they would like to connect with you or reach out?
Um, I am on social media. pjtemple.com is my website where it's kind of like the central hub. And then I'm on Spotify with some of the um, music that I've done with my husband. And I'm PJ Temple, he's Mr. Echo. So together we're Echoes in the Temple.
Sounds-
Um,
Yeah, I
and
love.
yeah, thank you. And then I'm on Instagram as well. I'm on Instagram and yeah, I do like a lot of my writing is through the website and it's all connected through there. So yeah, pgtemple.com is the best place to find me.
Are you allowed to share the name of the book or any of the songs and the genre of music that you do? The music,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. So with the music, the one of the songs I'm on is called Affliction.
yeah.
Um, and it's under Mr. Echoes on Spotify. But it's a song about like it starts with what is pain and tells the story of love and how like
Oh,
twisted and convoluted love is, but also how great it is.
it's just real. Yeah, I love that.
Um, we love love, we hate love, so it's representative of that. And then we did some work on, actually, we did a piece that also under Mr. Echo's Spotify, which has to do with like addiction. So it could be like, the one we did was on social media addiction. And I can send you links to that. I don't know if I shared
Please,
that with you,
please
but
come to me in the description below.
yeah.
100%.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's some of the music. And then we're really super excited to be going to Chateau de Orcheva in France in
Lovely.
April to
Yeah.
work some more, just like it's a really nice, beautiful, beautiful residency in the countryside. So we're gonna be working on some more music, just kind of for 2 weeks, like uninterrupted. So we're really excited about doing that.
Oh, thank you. That sounds really awesome. Good luck with everything. Thank you for
Thank
coming along
you.
and sharing your story. It's been super empowering and inspirational. And I'm sure there's many listeners that are going to really resonate with what you said and how you feel. And thank you again. I'm really, really, empowered by what you said. And thank you. I really appreciate
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. You're so sweet. And,
it.
you
Thank
know, I love what you're doing. Just
you.
talking about, art and diversity in art, very needed. So,
Trying to platform other people's voices and raise their profiles too and just support each other along the way. Collaboration is always the key, and just
mhm.
building meaningful relationships, I think, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Take care.